Chapter 785. In April and May, Chan City was considered the lightest season of the year. The dry season had just begun, so hurricanes were rare. The seas on the island were calm, and there were very few tourists. Even the most deadly rush tide was missed. Because of this period of time was affectionately called seclusion season by the members of the headquarters. Since the end of March, a considerable number of ability users had applied to enter Volcano Island for seclusion. It wasn't overcrowded, but at the very least, the seclusion rooms on the island, especially those high-quality areas, were in short supply. These days were painful and happy for the senior security expert Wolf, who was also the head of the security team. He would always miss the best time for cultivation because of the heavy duty on duty, but he would get some extra benefits because of his key position. Relying on this unique circumstance, he became a veteran B-class expert. However, perhaps it was also because of this circumstance that he was still a veteran B-class expert. It was currently the middle of the afternoon in Chan City. The weather wasn't too good. It had been raining since the morning. It was different from the torrential rain that usually passed by in a moment during the day. The rain was intermittent. Wolf felt a bit uncomfortable after being cooped up in his room for a long time. He took his two subordinates and patrolled the island reef area, checking the security equipment and the situation of the enchantments. The island reef area was filled with powerful people from the society and various powers of the inner world. Many people had taboo when it came to cultivation, so there were all kinds of restricted areas. Things like entering and flying were prohibited. The rules were very strict. Even the security team had to follow them. It wasn't easy for them to walk around, so they relied on idle chatter to get by. Before this, the hot headlines of Xia City and Saka City had given them something to talk about. They also calculated that with the speed of the Flying Devil Ray, it would only take 2.5 hours to get from Xia City to Chan City. Next, Assistant A gestured on the security zone map. While chatting, he pointed out, luckily, Langdon can finally avoid the 13th zone this year. Assistant B whistled, then after the qualification test, he'll have to find a new number. How tiring. Wolf knew the tricks of his two assistants, so he said, next, we'll go to the 13th zone. Assistant A and Assistant B groaned, Captain, for the sake of the weather. We'll go through the 13th zone and pass quickly. The two assistants' worries turned into joy. Oh, smart, no, brilliant. Repairing equipment and wards had always been hard work. The equipment was fine, but when it came to high-end wards, well, it was more popular nowadays to call it configuration knowledge. It always gave the security team a headache. Wolf was an expert in this field. He knew the importance of daily patrols for security work, but since there was no one in District 13 this year, there was no need to torture his subordinates. The patrol was coming to an end. The three of them chatted as they moved forward. They naturally talked about the reason why the 13th sector was empty this year. Assistant A casually clicked on last month's report. It's been more than 4 months. The legendary plane is still a legend. Volcanic Island's quarterly income has dropped by almost 5%. Now, those bosses would rather drink the wind in the Pacific Ocean than come back to meditate and train. Rolf calmly replied, high-level seclusion areas are still in short supply. Moreover, extraordinaries can use it for free, but B-class and below don't have such treatment. Hey, Captain, year-end performance has nothing to do with rent. In terms of consumables, extraordinaries crush architects. Architects are also different from awakened ones. But you have Langdon. Not just one Langdon. This sentence made Assistant A choke back his complaints. Rolf didn't say anything more. If he continued, it would involve the security team's gray income area, which wouldn't be good for anyone. He had been on duty at Volcanic Island for 3 years. It was very likely that he would be transferred at the end of the year or early next year. There was no need to be the bad guy for this kind of thing. He returned to the topic of searching for a new plane. In the South Pacific region, there are endless clues about a new plane. Deputy Secretary General Gong's aura is like this rain, appearing and disappearing. It's said that there are also traces of ape-like creatures unique to that plane. It's only right for the boss to go and search. At least it can shut those busybodies up. Assistant A was a bit gossipy. Along the way, I heard that Toyama auction house is very generous. Will President Abner and the others attend the Jade Lights High Seas auction? Toyama doesn't have that much influence. But someone did. Rolf gave an ambiguous answer and then said, because of this, Chan needs 2 more layers of blankets when it catches a cold. There are city guards in the main city, but there's only us on Volcanic Island. If any mutated reptiles crawl in. Assistant B shuddered. It will face the anger of hundreds of architects and even extraordinaries. If they do, I can deduct your performance right now. Pretend I didn't say anything. Assistant B also shut up. The corner of Rolf's mouth twitched. In the end, he couldn't help but complain. The association needs to hire a professional manager for Volcanic Island. How about poaching from intercontinental hotels? Due to the special function of Volcanic Island, there was a phenomenon of the strength of the users and the defenders here being inverted. The security team inevitably changed to a service type. Providing consumables, maintaining the barrier, and at most providing the first wave of warnings. In short, he was just an assistant. His responsibility was greater than the heavens, but the one doing the work was an ant. It was fine if nothing happened, but once something did happen, he would be the scapegoat. No matter how rich the gray income was, Rolf did not have any attachment to it. After chatting for a while, he thought of business. Remember the partial upgrade in 2 days, how could I forget this? Assistant B bent his finger. Upgrading Mr. Gong Chi's seclusion area. The constructor is Ms. Dollar, and the inspector is President Abner. There are 3 extraordinaries. Choose one out of the 3. No matter which one you choose to provoke, it'll be a dead end. But isn't this a compulsory topic? Assistant A responded coldly. It said that Mr. Gong seemed to have chewed a large piece of raw mustard at the consultation meeting last week. If Deputy Secret Director Gong comes back, it might be our turn to eat mustard. At this point, the conversation became a little awkward. They all knew that the so-called upgrade of the seclusion area was the installation of visual monitoring and interference precision perception systems. In other words, it was to carry out omnidirectional surveillance without any blind spots. Be it in terms of privacy or safety, this was unacceptable to any seclusion person, let alone Gong Chi, the Deputy Secretary General of the Association. However, Gong Chi had been in seclusion for too long. It was almost certain that his soul had left his body and entered another plane. What was left in the seclusion area was only an empty shell of a physical body. In this state, he couldn't raise any objections. And under the stimulation of the benefits of the new plane, the attitudes of his various relatives, friends, and allies became more and more ambiguous. Until the upgrade motion was passed. Regarding this, Wolf, the natural scapegoat, was worried. I hope the end of the plane incident can be delayed. It would be more appropriate for me to resign next year. Of course, if there was a breakthrough in these 2 days, there wouldn't be a need for this. It would be a perfect dream. Sighing, he raised his head, and a dark red stream of light flashed above his head. He made a wish at the shooting star, huh? Wolf's eyes widened to the point that raindrops dripped into his eyes. Yes, there were still dark rain clouds above his head, but that light, his bracelet vibrated, and the security warning system lit up with a yellow light, which meant that a non-direct threat was approaching or had been nearby. Wolf raised his head and spoke to his men in the duty room. Report the target. Boss, a high-energy ray shot down from the sky, brushed past the no-fly zone in the 4th zone, and drilled into the bottom of the sea. It's about 30 kilometers away from the island's warning line. Maybe it's a high-power laser. Is there any damage to the barrier? There's a hole, but it can repair itself. Ask Chan's garrison if there are any related exercises. Definitely not, or we would have received the news. What about the Star Alliance? Their space fleet? When those people were cleaning up the space junk, the main cannon would occasionally fire. At least that's what the public report said. The military committee's consultation platform is habitually disconnected. Oh, damn. The man in the duty room spoke more quickly. There's a strong reaction at the bottom of the sea. The energy index, no, there's interference reaction at the swamp area. The instrument average is 1.7 dg, and the extreme is 2.3 dg. Preliminary estimate is a fully evolved B-class mutant. Beside him, Assistant A said, if it's a B-class individual, there's no threat. Mutants often pass through the surrounding waters. Maybe they were stimulated by the laser? Maybe. Wolf was already numb to these kinds of things. He didn't even need to think, and a plan popped up in his mind. The self-healing of the barrier is too slow. Group 4, deal with it. As for the sea, take the image first and prepare the inducer. It's best if there's no conflict. But if there are some ladies and gentlemen who like specimens, we can consider it later. As he spoke, the originally pitter-patter of rain became heavier, and a thin layer of fog had appeared between the islands. The wind blew the rain, and the fog assaulted their faces, slightly obscuring their vision. Wolf exhaled with the intention of blowing the fog away, but for some reason, the flow of the fog was not disturbed at all. It was a strange contrast to the strands of rain that were deflected by the force. Wolf was stunned. He suddenly felt a sense of déjà vu, as if he had experienced this before. It was also at this moment that the underwater camera equipment set up in the distant waters moved into position and transferred the image of the mutant that had suddenly appeared over. The moment the image appeared, Wolf made a clear judgment. This thing doesn't look like a marine mutant. It looks more like a big ape. As soon as this thought rose and fell, the ape creature with a body as dark as blood leaped into the sea and instantly escaped from the surveillance area. At this time, the man in the duty room followed up with a report. The target mutant jumped out of the sea. It's calling. There was no need for his subordinate to say anything more. Wolf could already capture the powerful shockwave that was pressing in from afar. It wasn't just the energy transmission of air molecules, but a powerful turbulence that involved the level of the swamp area. It had astonishing penetrative power. Even though it was weakened by the barrier of the islands during the transmission process, there were still aftershocks that seeped through. For a moment, the security system's alarms rang incessantly. It was unknown how many barriers and warning systems in sensitive areas were activated. Chapter 786. That ape was provoking him. Maybe the lasers from the sky had disturbed its sweet dreams, or maybe it was some other inexplicable reason. Whatever it was, the ape's attitude was very unfriendly, and it had brought Wolf a lot of trouble. At this time, he had already forgotten where his sudden thoughts were pointing. More than 30 alarm signals converged into the security system at the same time. It was as if a great enemy was invading. In each of the seclusion areas, some of the more sensitive residents began to inquire the duty room, some sent out detectors, and some even called Wolf directly. The continuous vibration of the wristband disturbed his pulse, and the flashing names that could not be messed with almost gave him a heart attack. Reset the warning signal system. Also, F*King Inducer. Team 1, get rid of that thing. Before he finished, a roar that connected the abyss and the material plane boomed over again, obviously causing another wave of chaos. Assistant B slapped his forehead. That ape must be in heat. It's an ape-like creature because I don't see a tail. Assistant A's biological foundation was obviously more solid, and it was one of the words he said that stirred Wolf's emotions again. He suddenly stopped and turned to stare at Assistant A. Say it again, the one in front. I don't see a tail. Further ahead? Ape-like creature? It was a simple phrase, but it was like a bolt of lightning striking Rolf's mind. The rumor hidden in the depths of his memory was reflected together with the current situation. Ape-like creatures, new dimension, ape-like creatures. What? Because the topic was too sudden, the two assistants did not understand immediately. Wolf did not care about them. The rumored clue that appeared in the South Pacific region, why would it be here? But then again, it was meaningless to think about these reasons now. After all, this was the place where the clue to the new dimension first appeared. So what if they fought a cycle in half a year? Wolf did not think about the complicated factors behind it. He only knew one thing: this was a pie falling from the sky. He raised his wrist abruptly, and through the wristband, he ordered Team 1, who should have gone out to hunt, "Capture it alive. We must capture it alive." "I'll be right there." Before he could finish, Wolf suddenly choked. It was as if a thin electric current had swept across his scalp, and his hair stood on end. Under the gloomy sky, a circle of jade-green light clearly lit up, causing the sky to lose its original color. That was the result of the activation of the main enchantment buried on the volcanic island. The control of the main barrier was still in Rolf's hands, and he definitely did not give the order to activate it. Aside from President Abner, there was also Madame Dale. For the sake of the project that would take place 2 days later, she did stay on the volcanic island and was the first to notice the change. The report from the duty room came 2 seconds late. Wolf did not say anything. He only asked the other side to turn on the panoramic image formed by many observation points. It could be seen that the green spiritual light of the barrier that the important areas of the islands and reefs were giving off was concentrated on the surface of the sea, like a bunch of grapes that had just been picked and placed on a grayish-blue porcelain plate. They were translucent and seemed to be alive. Compared to a few seconds ago, the strength of the barrier was more than 10 times stronger. Moreover, as everyone knew, as the top barrier grandmaster in the inner world, Madame Constance Dale was never a conservative person. Compared to hiding in the barrier and passively resisting, she preferred to use unimaginable barrier spells to set up an inescapable net and hunt to her heart's content. From Rolf's point of view, under the gloomy sky, there was a dark golden light twisting and turning. After it took shape, it rapidly enlarged. It could be seen that it was the mysticism symbol of a single circle pentagram. With this symbol as the core, dozens of identical yet different circles extended in all directions. They were connected by straight lines and arcs of light, and there were also indecipherable runes flowing among them. This strange, gorgeous, and complicated diagram instantly connected the energy passageway between the spiritual and material planes. The turbulent storms of the abyss area and the ceaseless flow of energy in the material world converged here. Even from dozens of kilometers away, one could vaguely feel that the flow of air and the waves of the seawater had instantly become stagnant. It was as if the legendary time-stop magic had been cast. It was a treacherous contrast to the surrounding area. If the sea and the void were like this, then there was no need to mention the monkey, no, the ape-like creature trapped within. The provocative howl came to an abrupt end. Madame Dale has made her move. The team leader of Team 1 reported in a suppressed voice. He unconsciously exerted force, causing his voice to tremble. "We can't go through. Stay where you are." "No, stay further away." Rolf looked up at the sky and sighed. An extraordinary had actually made her move so quickly. He had wanted to capture the large ape that he suspected to be a creature from the new dimension and fight for some credit. Now it seemed that Madame Dale was indeed one of the few powerhouses in the society. She was much sharper and more decisive than a middle-level cadre like him. Since she was the one who had made a move to snatch the pie, Rolf could only extinguish that thought. He quickly adjusted his position and positioned himself as a support to make up for any mistakes. He quickly found Madame Dale's number and dialed it without hesitation. "Thank you for your help, Madame Dale. I believe you must have discovered the close relationship between the ape-like creature and the new dimension." Halfway through his sentence, he heard a cold snort from the other side. Rolf's heart twitched. He did not know how he had offended her. The light in the corner of his eyes changed. When he turned his head, he saw that on the distant sea surface, a bloody light was leaping. With a dazzling trajectory, it forcefully broke through the restraints of the time-stop zone and escaped into the distant sky. In the process, every inch of the trajectory of the light represented evaporation and melting damage. The amount of bloody light that flew into the clouds was reduced by at least half compared to when it was at its peak. But the reality was that the large ape, which had been defined as a weapon in hand, still forcefully passed through the temporary barrier cage in the outer sea of the volcanic island and disappeared from everyone's line of sight. Tisk, how embarrassing. Madame Dale's self-deprecating expression combined with her usual gloomy temperament made Rolf want to slap himself in the face. He did not know what to say after that. But Madame Dale herself did not end the call. Instead, she analyzed the conversation in a chatting manner. That large ape interferes in both the spiritual and material planes. The structure of its body and soul is fully mixed. It should have achieved 100% energy transformation, so its speed is beyond common sense. Ordinary barriers can't trap it. This kind of aberration creature is very rare. The corner of Rolf's mouth twitched. He unconsciously straightened his body. It is very rare. It suddenly appeared in the sea. Maybe it's because of the stimulation of the high-energy laser. Rolf quickly gave a brief introduction of the previous situation for reference. And just as he was speaking, from the direction of Chan City, another ray of light soared into the sky and rushed over here. It was unknown which extraordinary with the ability to fly had come to join in the fun. Madame Dale snorted again. The mysterious structure that was originally suspended in the sky above the sea suddenly disappeared. The light of the volcanic island's barrier also began to fade. Perhaps this female extraordinary had already gone far away to chase after the large ape. Connie, everyone who sees this has a share. There weren't many people in Chan City who dared to directly call Madame Dale. Rolf vaguely recognized the voice of Vice President Marin. Although he could not see any trace of Madame Dale, Marin's traveling light was heading straight for the open sea. Clearly, the competition and pursuit had already begun. The pie flew away. Wolf subconsciously grinned. The meaning behind his smile was complicated. He subconsciously took 2 steps forward. Originally, he wanted to return to the duty room to make arrangements. However, the surging clouds and blowing rain around him were getting thicker and thicker, almost blocking the road under his feet. There was also an even more wonderful feeling of emptiness. It once again disturbed the thoughts that had previously almost disappeared. That sense of déjà vu reappeared, and it easily added the most crucial element now. Rolf's body stiffened. His memories from a few months ago flowed back. I did indeed experience this scene. Although I was on the periphery at the time, this strange feeling of the surging clouds, as if I was high in the clouds, was something I experienced half a year ago. He could confirm that President Abner, the priestess of the Order of Justice, and Old Ho, who had just eaten mustard, were in the core area at that time. The feeling of confusion caused by the surrounding rain and mist was disassembled and reassembled at this moment. The corresponding logical chain finally connected in the void. A new plane. Wasn't this the projection of a new plane? Before he could truly experience the thrill of a clear mind, the wristband flashed with yellow light again. Today was truly a day of apprehension. A subordinate in the duty room reported loudly, "Captain, there's an abnormal vibration in Area 1. Area 1? Rolf blinked. Suddenly, he shuddered again. Seclusion room, Gong Chi. The ground beneath his feet suddenly trembled. In the next moment, a dazzling red light shone from the wristband. The security system exploded with the highest level of alarm. The light in the room was dim. Only the life support system's instrument lights flickered, faintly illuminating the naked human bodies in the cabin. The air temperature here was more than 10 degrees lower than the outside world. Acumen College's spring and autumn uniforms seemed a bit thin. Ruiwen didn't care at all. She immersed herself in assembling. The structure she assembled was the same as the transmission array used on Northern Mountain Lake. The little girl's movements were skilled. She had practiced similar tasks countless times. The various structures of the transmission array had been maximized to the point of being modular, but clanking sounds were unavoidable when assembling. There was absolutely no lack of an automatic alarm system in this seclusion room. Soon, the special situation was reflected in the security system. But the turmoil in the outside world, especially the automatic reset of the warning system, effectively concealed the unforeseen event here. Ruiwen concentrated on the work in her hands. According to Luo Nan's original plan, Ruiwen had nothing to do with this territory. It was more of a gambling type of power. But now that the research and configuration were complete, the links were a bit more complicated, but the reliability was increasing. The key was the transmission array, and the safeguard was Roy 1. It's about to begin. Luo Nan's telepathic thoughts were transmitted over. At nearly the same time, a dark red glow, as thin as a thread, penetrated through the void. It fell straight onto the centermost warehouse of the quiet room. They were separated by a hair's breadth, but there were fine ripples. Chapter 787. It was quite normal for an extraordinary to set up an enchantment within the seclusion grounds. At Gong Qi's level, it was impossible for anyone to completely entrust their lives to the so-called security team. This was a variable that Luo Nan could imagine, but he was powerless to do anything about. At least, this was the case before he revised his plan. The slender red beam collided with the enchantment like a high-energy laser. It scorched the barrier, but the work of breaking the barrier did not proceed smoothly. The enchantment was nearly invisible, but it was built upon the foundation of Gong Qi's powerful fleshly body. It integrated with the abundant energy reserves of the seclusion area through an exquisite circulation of energy. It could be called the pinnacle of enchantment technology in the inner world. Perhaps the enchantment was limited by the way it was operated, so it could not be maintained for a long time. However, it took into consideration all sorts of unexpected situations that might occur during the period of seclusion. Its bearing capacity for the first wave of impact was quite astonishing. Its purpose was to resist the instantaneous damage of an extraordinary. The hidden structure of the incorporeal enchantment was revealed under the scorching of the slender beam of light. The precise and complex structural diagram flickered indefinitely. Its circulation was still strict, constantly digesting and transferring the impact force it was withstanding. The impact from the polar domain did not reach its upper limit, but the follow-up energy still had to bear an even more important task. If the energy was excessively consumed here, it would be very difficult to achieve the desired goal of Gong Qi's tough and sturdy fleshly body. What was even worse was that the life support system had triggered the highest level of alarm the moment it received the impact. It had also activated the forced awakening mechanism. Of course, Gong Qi's soul was currently in an out-of-body state and he was imprisoned in the cloud world. He could not wake up. However, the floor beneath the cockpit had already split open. The mechanical installation drove the cockpit to rapidly sink. In the blink of an eye, the middle and lower parts of the cockpit had already sunk beneath the floor. The split opening wasted no time at all and began to close up. The life support system only needed a second and a half to sink into a permanent fortification capable of withstanding the attack of an Earth-penetrating missile. Whoosh! Roy 1, who had been assembling the transmission array ahead, let out a sigh of relief. She stopped what she was doing and breathed out. She switched to working mode and swung her arm. It was as if an incorporeal blade slashed through the air, producing a hissing sound. The impact instantly struck the enchantment outside the cockpit. It appeared to be a sharp slash, but what it embodied was not penetrative power. When the collision occurred, the originally strict internal structure of the barrier seemed to have been replaced with a high-power engine that had been installed with an accelerator, causing it to hum and spin wildly. The situation was like a truck that was fully loaded with goods. It was moving at a steady and uniform speed, but in the blink of an eye, it had entered the territory of a sports car. Moreover, it was still accelerating, and the brake system had completely malfunctioned. Even if there was a boundless plane in front of it, the changes in the flow that exceeded the limits of what it could endure also accelerated the wear and tear of the entire system. Structural links accelerated and lost speed one after another, and the tight structure began to distort and deform until it was completely out of shape. Half a second ago, the barrier that was hard to break was like a balloon that was filled with water. With a bang, it exploded, and the scattered spiritual waves swept through the entire quiet room. It also brought with it an even sharper alarm. This secluded quiet room was completely filled with flashing red light. But no matter what, the shattering of the barrier determined the course of events. On the upper edge of the cockpit that had already sunk halfway, a small opening was silently eroded open. The fine red light drilled in through this small hole and firmly hit the forehead of Gong Qi, who was sleeping with his eyes closed inside the cockpit. Beautifully done. A praise came from the distant void. At the same time, there were indistinctly discernible howls and roars in the background. It was slightly chaotic. Rowan still didn't turn her head. She just quietly switched back to her work mode and continued with the finishing touches on the work at hand. As for the cockpit, the translucent nutrient fluid suddenly turned turbid. Then, a large number of air bubbles surged until it boiled. Flames. Blood-red flames ignited from between Gong Chi's eyebrows. They quickly burned through his closed eyelids, and then came out from his nostrils, mouth, and ear orifices. From point to surface, from head to toe, they covered his entire body. Under the raging blood-red flames, Gong Chi's tough body, which didn't show any signs of aging, began to distort and swell. What changed even faster was the gases in the cockpit that were exploding. The cockpit even burst open, and then the escape passage that led downwards was firmly stuck. The floor that was about to close up was also stuck there. The mechanical force and the dissimulated life force that was wreaking havoc in the cockpit clashed so powerfully that the entire floor of the room began to shake violently. Of course, this could also be due to the repeated bombardment of this area by the security team outside and the few extraordinaries who had finally come back to their senses. The seclusion quiet room hidden deep beneath the island began to collapse. The powerful mental attacks from at least 2 different extraordinaries also squeezed through the outer protective barrier, crushing inside layer by layer. The room could collapse at any moment, but Rowan didn't care in the slightest. She just lowered her head and used the testing apparatus Luo Nan gave her to inspect the error of the transmission array to see if it was within the permitted range. An explosive boom rang out, and the shattered parts of the cockpit sprayed out from the gaps in the floor. Without the obstruction, the 2 somewhat deformed floors finally closed together. But they only closed for half a second before the berserk power from below blasted them apart in one fell swoop. Blood-colored flames rose from the ground, illuminating the entire quiet room. They suppressed the flickering red light of the alarm. It was as if an invisible brush was sketching and smearing within the flames. Mountain ramparts, winding rivers of blood, cave temples, and so on gradually took form. Together, they constructed a treacherous picture of a lonely peak. After this picture of a lonely peak, the outline of a human body gradually became clear. It seemed to have condensed into some sort of liquid substance. It warped endlessly, gradually taking shape. The island structure that the quiet room was built on began to collapse at an accelerated rate. And the existence within the bloody flames that seemed human yet inhuman walked over in Rowan's direction with heavy footsteps. Rowan remained unresponsive. The flaming humanoid brushed past Rowan's body. It walked all the way to the metal chest that she had brought with her before, the chest that had already been mostly dismantled. There was still a set of mechanical components that Rowan had not touched within the chest. As the flaming humanoid drew closer, the drifting tail of flames swept across the metal chest outside. High heat was transmitted over, and what burst out from the chest was a deep blue electric flame. The glow of the barrier of the volcanic island had just dimmed, but it shone once more. This time, the deep blue color of the barrier had turned quite a bit deeper. It was suffused with a purplish-red luster. Warped runes revolved within each large grape, and they passed through the internal pipes to transmit a majestic power to the location of Area 1. The barrier of that area clearly could not withstand this power. Just as it was about to collapse, it was forcefully controlled by Madame Delay. The structure of the barrier suddenly changed from defending against external forces to suppressing and sealing inward. This was Madame Delay's habitual method, but the other spiritual type extraordinary who stood across from her was Canon Monroe, who was famous for his long-range firepower. He was clearly not pleasing to the eye. "You've covered this place so tightly that I can't even use my hands and feet." Hiss, there's a conflict between our soul forces again. You're disturbing me. Ever since the rise of the cage theory, a certain genius youth's theory of assault had also become widespread. An old hand like Monroe loved this sort of joke the most. From time to time, he would play around with it. Using it on a strong person of the opposite sex at the same level gave him an exceptional sense of accomplishment. Madame Delay always wore a thick robe that covered her body and a hood that covered her head. She looked like a mysterious witch from the Middle Ages. She couldn't be bothered to bicker with the old bastard Monroe, nor would she change her most habitual way of doing things. She turned a deaf ear to Monroe's protests. Moreover, they had already wasted too much time. Above the too spiritual type extraordinary, Vice President Marin's brows were tightly furrowed. He was rather anxious in his heart. Abner was away, and as the first vice president, he was the one in charge. If something were to happen, it would be a great loss of face. This was a bad omen. Marin was a pure physical extraordinary. Mental senses weren't his forte, but his spiritual senses were sharp and his intuition was astonishing. He instinctively felt that the situation in Area 1 and Gong Chi's situation were very bad. However, that old fellow had always been untrustworthy. He had set up too many defensive measures in his seclusion room, and now they had all become fatal obstacles. But these defensive measures were all intact, so where did the danger inside come from? I'll go in. Impatience finally wore away the last bit of Marin's patience. It also burned away the arrogance of his status. His figure sank down. He wanted to use the most direct and skilled method to directly penetrate the barrier and figure out the problem inside. As for whether or not Gong Chi would have any objections after this, he would wait until he had a future to think about it. Marin's thoughts were clear. His tyrannical body propelled an inconceivable force, and he crashed down like a meteorite falling from the sky. Even Madame Delay, who controlled the barrier, had to make way for him. But the moment his body passed through the barrier, Marin's rapidly descending body suddenly came to a halt. The two spiritual type extraordinaries in midair also reacted at the same time. All three of them stopped what they were doing and turned their heads to look at the sky. In the gaps between the gloomy and heavy clouds above the volcanic island, dark blue waves of light suddenly flashed and leaped. The surrounding clouds seemed to have turned into a strange lantern. Intense light flickered inside and leaped about. In the end, it tore apart the fragile outer skin and sprayed out dazzling electric flames. And in the eyes of the three extraordinary, when the electric flames tore apart the clouds, there was a powerful force field that shouldn't have appeared. It tore apart the barrier between the abyss area and the material world at the same time, allowing the spiritual and material planes to fully interfere. Moreover, it set up an invisible guideway that locked onto the target of the berserk energy. Rumble. The sound of thunder came from the horizon, and the rapidly expanding air stirred restlessly in the void. But what spread at a speed thousands of times faster than this powerful vibration were the three electric spears that shot down from the clouds. Chapter 788. At this moment, the situation on the physical plane on Volcano Island was soul-stirring. However, on the corresponding abyssal zone, the possibility of most spectators being spectators was immediately eliminated. At present, the abyssal zone had completely turned into a destructive windstorm. The collision of the transcendent level forces and the explosion of each force affected the magnificent power of the torrents in the abyss zone. Impact and recoil, control and loss of control. Under the high-speed confrontation on the mental plane, under the pressure of a powerful opponent, even extraordinaires could not take care of every detail. As a result, the level of chaos continued to increase. The accumulated violent power swept from top to bottom, sweeping through every level that people could reach with their thoughts. Even a veteran B-rank powerhouse like Rolf could not recover from the impact of the lightning spear. He was so shocked by the surrounding void that it was as fragile as thin paper that he found it hard to breathe. He was afraid that a moment of carelessness would cause the barrier to break and the abyssal zone's torrent to flood out, wiping out the entire security team. Rolf was already like this. As a participant in the battle, the pressure was even more astonishing. The high-level attack and defense of the abyssal zone needed to draw out a relatively clear vein in the deep chaos that continued to increase. With great control, the direction of the battle would not be greatly deviated. The problem was that Madame Delay and the others had made a mistake in their judgment from the beginning. The lightning spear that had been thrown down seemed to be an explosive attack. It was indeed so at the beginning, but only when it was truly received did it reveal the exquisite structure and operation mode hidden deep within the abyssal zone. That was the continuous lashing of the long whip and the iron chain. The enormous power from the abyss, under the effect of the extremely efficient mode, came and went one after another. The bright light and the dark thunder were almost endless, not giving them any chance to catch their breath. The best way, and also the only way to deal with it, was to endure this round of impact and then plan again. Of course, the three extraordinaires were not really suppressed to the point that they could not breathe. Malin, who was not good at psychic sensing, could still give orders. Electromagnetic ability, what's the situation below? The two spiritual-type extraordinaires had already sent their thoughts into the seclusion area. They intertwined and swept through the area, and they also found something. Madame Delay said, "The palace life support cabin is broken, and the remains are missing." Monroe followed closely. "That guy is equipped with an exoskeleton armor and is hiding his head and tail. Furthermore, he managed to conceal his aura. It seems like he was setting fire earlier. The form of the burning seems to be somewhat familiar." According to the cage theory, the current situation was more or less a situation where the two parties were attacking each other at the same time. Everyone could take part of the initiative, but no one could seize more opportunities to win. Of course, Marlin and the other two were on the same side, but to effectively work together in the abyssal zone storm that had erupted in an instant, they still needed to constantly adjust. The problem was that the other party was also constantly changing. It wasn't the kind of inevitable trend towards chaos, but rather a subtle reverse effect. Strange. Men Luo couldn't help but add. In the process of colliding and bombarding each other, the chaos in the abyss area would increase exponentially every second. Hundreds and thousands of variables would appear every second. They were huge in number and lacked connection, thus bringing about greater interference. Of course, the combatants had to do their best to eliminate the interference. The problem was that the strong control of soul power would cause the other side to become even stronger while suppressing a portion of the changes. After all, power was always interacting with each other, and no one could completely transcend the abyss and exist independently. Everyone could only evaluate and calculate based on experience. It would be too flattering to say that it was calculation. Most of the time, it was still using experience, half guessing and half guessing. In this way, combatants like Men Luo, while the stirring power was getting stronger and stronger, their control basically showed a smooth downward trend. The power of extraordinaries was reflected in the word smooth. If it were anyone else, their control would only fall precipitously. This was the reason why certain rank B spiritual type attacks and defenses in the abyss area were often 3-second men. What made Men Luo feel strange was that the other party's operating efficiency in the abyss area didn't decrease after every round of explosive increase in variables. Instead, it increased. At first, Men Luo, including Madame Delay and Marlin, thought that the other party was doing a vicious cycle of forceful reinforcement, so they waited for the other side to run out of power before counterattacking. But now, they finally realized that the other party wasn't increasing in power, but in efficiency. In the chaos of exponential growth, the efficiency of power integration was constantly increasing, and the rate of improvement was getting faster and faster. The extent of accumulation was also getting more and more obvious. *T. The consequence of a wrong judgment was that they had missed the other party's rhythm. In other words, they had completely lost the initiative. Counterattack. Marlin growled. In the attack and defense of the abyss area, his physical side was relatively marginalized, but it was also easy to adjust. As a physical side, he had to be aware of it. He didn't hesitate to take damage and act as a sharp knife to counterattack, forcefully interrupting the other party's strange rhythm. Under the impetus of Marlin's powerful will, which was almost tangible, his physical body's blood energy was forcibly increased, and with a burning posture, he achieved the resonance of the body and soul structure, interfering with the spiritual plane. Based on the foundation of stable matter, the blood energy was like a flying mountain, forcibly suppressing the almost irreversible chaotic situation in the abyss area. This kind of momentum couldn't last long, but it had the power to turn the situation around with a surprise attack. At least, that was what Madame Delay and Men Luo thought. They also used the momentum to counterattack. However, the other party retreated. That's right, they retreated. When Marin had forcefully interrupted them and Delay and Monroe were about to counterattack, the thunderbolts and lightning bolts had all retreated. Moreover, it separated from Marlon and the other two at the same time. At the same time. 3 extraordinaries, 3 different ability natures and rhythms. The difference in separation was simply measured in microseconds. It was precisely because of this precise uniformity that they didn't have the chance to stick together again. They left as soon as they said they would, and the abyss area's reaction instantly turned to 0. This is impossible. Men Luo cried out involuntarily. He had always been known as a long-range firepower on the spiritual plane. He was powerful, but he was lacking in exquisiteness. The instantaneous difference he felt was also the most obvious. In the abyss area's chaotic environment, this kind of observation and the corresponding exquisite microcontrol technique had already exceeded the limits of his common sense. How did he do it? Marlon was stunned for half a second. Compared to the opponent's microsecond level of error, using his units to calculate the magnitude, the difference was basically equivalent to the passage of a week. After a week, Marlon's face flushed red. He changed the direction of his heavy punch and bombarded the island below. The upper structure of Gong Chi's isolation room collapsed in one fell swoop. The situation was the same as in the abyss area. There was no longer any resistance here, and there was no trace of the so-called Deep Blue Walker either. There was only the collapsed structure's wreckage mixed in with the mud powder and stones. Marlon stepped into the ruins. There were traces of the structure of space-time trembling here. There was also the smell of high-temperature baking mixed in with the smell of ionization in the air. The traces left behind were not few, but abundant enough to make one's brain explode. Vice President, the volcanic island's new plane, the mist illusion, has disappeared. It seems like it happened before the lightning strike. Wolf, who was at the periphery, finally had the opportunity to come over and report. Marlon's face twitched. If anyone dared to say that the so-called new plane was a natural phenomenon that wasn't man-made, he would spit on that fellow's face right now. Chapter 789. Who in the world are you? A berserk thought swept out. Within the misty labyrinth, the sand painting that was temporarily pieced together by millions and millions of domain fragments soundlessly shattered. The previous scene stopped in the bloody light of raging flames. The human body warped and expanded until the moment it completely deformed and melted. The things that followed didn't have much meaning for Gong Chi. He just knew that his fleshly body had reached the level depicted in the scene. It was already an irreversible destruction. Gong Chi was still unwilling to believe the truth presented in the scene. He found it even harder to believe that his terrible situation was single-handedly created by an underage youth like Luo Nan. In a short amount of time, his thoughts cleaved apart the surrounding rolling and whistling dust storm countless times. He wanted to obtain a clear answer to support the absurd and terrifying logic of the scene. But there was no response from start to finish. He knew that such a state of mind was terrible. He tried to control it, but the changes in the situation from another space and time, as well as the deeper feedback from the abyss region and the solidified configuration, made his calm and steady mind, which he had always been proud of, tremble and crack at the deepest level. He found it hard to restrain himself. Anyone who saw their own fleshly body liquefy and evaporate in the flames, turning into nourishing fertilizer for the other species, while their soul body in another space and time suddenly became a lonely ghost would probably have this kind of feeling. At the same time, Gong Chi also had to bear the impact of the solidified configuration in the abyss region of Earth. This was equivalent to the rupture of his cultivation foundation. His soul body flickered indeterminately. His aura repeatedly fluctuated. This was much more accurate than the opponent's flashy sand painting. Gong Chi wasn't an ordinary person by now. Snake Tongue had never seen Gong Chi like this before. Of course, what happened on Chan City's holy land of cultivation, Volcanic Island, far exceeded her imagination. Right now, Gong Qi still had the curtain of his extraordinary domain. He still possessed the strength of an extraordinary. However, Snake Tongue felt that the extraordinary soul body in front of her was unprecedentedly ethereal. It was like a vicious and ugly demon. It was unknown when it would melt under the sunlight. Snake Tongue's shock and fear towards Luo Nan, who had created all of this, was even greater than Gong Qi's. She was also affected by the previous events. She was wrapped in absurd delight. These complex emotions pieced together Luo Nan's image in her mind once more. But even she knew that there were far too many subjective things stuffed into it. Layers upon layers of distortion and rendering. He was like an evil demon god, invading her already limited thinking bandwidth. Maybe this is another nightmare? Of course, it was leaked by Gong Qi. Perhaps Gong Qi sensed Snake Tongue's attention, but he suddenly turned his head. His actions were completely human, and they were displayed by his spirit body. It was even more ironic at this time. Gong Qi himself sensed it as well, and his gaze changed to become unprecedentedly savage and terrifying. He no longer needed to conceal anything. He directly extended his hand and grabbed Snake Tongue, who was wrapped in the veil of silence. She didn't have the slightest ability to resist. However, Snake Tongue suddenly had a marvelous feeling when she faced Gong Qi like this. Her thoughts circulated, but they didn't take form. Instead, they were nimble like she hadn't been in a long time. Even though she was mocking herself, she said, "I almost forgot. I'm about to die." Dying from anger is perhaps the most worthless way to die. Gong Qi's spirit body abruptly underwent another wave of bright and dark changes, reflecting his seriously unstable emotions. Amidst the radiating psychic waves, Snake Tongue thought that her time was up. But in reality, the powerful pressure transmitted by the veil of silence retreated. "You're right, we can't waste it." Gong Qi's thoughts were heavy as he suppressed his emotions, and he was like a volcano that was in an unstable state. But his control had returned, and it was still slowly increasing. He operated the curtain of extraordinary domain and did a few rounds of searching, but he still didn't find any trace of Luo Nan. He didn't get a reply either. After another round of failed attempts, he suddenly asked, "What do you think Luo Nan is doing?" "He's probably watching you make a fool of yourself." Snake Tongue completely let loose. She mocked him without the slightest bit of mercy. Gong Qi actually didn't get angry. He even discussed with a deadpan expression, "No, he's more likely dealing with some trouble." "Oh. He and his accomplices destroyed my fleshly body, but that place is a volcanic island reef. It's a closed-door area. There are 3 to 5 extraordinaries there all year round. No matter how outstanding their previous infiltration was, it was impossible for them to escape unscathed after triggering the security system. It's precisely because a large amount of energy was involved there that he missed an opportunity to deal a fatal blow." Gong Qi's thoughts couldn't be said to be wrong, but what logic was behind the neat and tidy logic of his thoughts? For a time, Snake Tongue couldn't find the right words to describe this feeling. She just felt awkward and weird. He missed an opportunity. "That's my opportunity." Gong Qi was still analyzing. His thoughts leaped back and forth. "I've already leaped into the extraordinary realm. My soul body is indestructible. So what if my foundation is damaged? There are many ways to make up for it in this world. He still can't do anything to me. He doesn't possess the ability to kill me, and he's missed opportunities again and again. When I first fell into the domain fragment trap, when my fleshly body was destroyed. That's right. If I miss an opportunity, I'll be punished. My opportunity has come." Snake Tongue asked, "What opportunity?" Gong Qi let out a low chuckle. He didn't answer. The extraordinary domain curtain that rose up around his body clearly contracted and rolled back. Then he escaped. Snake Tongue was truly stunned. She was under Gong Qi's control. She was unable to probe the changes in the external environment. She only knew that Gong Qi's speed was very fast. It didn't matter if his laws were chaotic within the sandstorm of the domain fragment. He just needed to use his own laws to temporarily replace and integrate them. The superiority of extraordinaries was displayed to the point of brilliance. The problem was that no matter how brilliant Gong Qi's flying techniques were, he was unable to change the nature of his actions. He ran away. He took advantage of Luo Nan's lack of attention to escape. He even ran away immensely proud of himself. Fine, he looked a bit excited. This kind of emotional bottom line was continuously exposed from his constant mental communication. Luo Nan destroyed my fleshly body. He ruined my foundation. He even transmitted the events that occurred in Earth's spacetime to me in real time. I know what he wants to do. He wants to crush my will, to destroy my spirit, to make me collapse without a fight. But his thinking is too simple. His live streaming was a major failure. He made this damned place establish a new connection with Earth's spacetime. The first reason was that you were tricked by him into becoming one with your body. The second reason was the backlash caused by the collapse of my foundation in the Abyss region. Adding in the live streaming, there are so many formulas. Why would I be afraid of not being able to solve the equations? Hearing Gong Qi's confident tone, Snake Tongue was skeptical. You solved it? I want to collect even more formulas. Gong Qi answered as if it was a matter of course. Luo Nan's biggest mistake was to treat this place as a trap. But this place isn't a warped cloud. Instead, it's a foundation and hub. Most importantly, it isn't monotonous at all. It's changing. As long as it's changing, there are rules that can be dug out. No matter how Snake Tongue viewed him, Gong Qi believed that he had already recovered from the blow of having his body destroyed. Moreover, he had entered an extraordinary state under the pressure and stimulation. His powers of observation were sharper. His train of thought was clearer. He discovered many hidden details and veins within the dust, mist, and sandstorm. Countless domain fragments were piled together within this misty labyrinth. At first glance, everything looked the same from every direction, but the details were different. There were large and small fragments. There were clear differences in the types and characteristics of their structures, as well as in the way they were distributed. They were completely different from the circulation of cloud energy in the clouds. People got lost here. On one hand, the laws were chaotic in this dangerous place. On the other hand, far too many disparate elements appeared in one's mind. It was the polar opposite of the cloud world. What's interesting is that the two are closely related. It's not just that one is on the outside and one is on the inside, one is on the inside and one is on the outside. It's because they both have suns. Suns? That's right. The suns that appear in the polar domain really do have an influence that reaches far and wide. We can see them in the clouds, but we can't see them here. However, there's a temperature that belongs to them. Gong Qi's spirit body revealed a lively smile. Do you remember? I once said that behind these domain fragments, there was bound to be an even more fundamental space-time frame. Perhaps this is it. In the depths of the layered domain fragments, perhaps that sun is the core of the space-time frame. It affects the operation of the dust, mist, and sandstorm, the fourth formula. When solving an equation, under a limited number of unknowns, the more relevant and meaningful formulas there were, the easier it would be to find the answer. Gong Qi had this feeling, and it was becoming more and more intense. He began to make a hypothesis. If I take the sun hidden in the depths of the domain fragments and treat it as a fixed number, I can simplify the problem and do some calculations. Gong Qi took the initiative to stop his explanation and put a large amount of energy into his calculation work. His flying speed became slower and slower until he gradually came to a stop. This old thing seemed to really have a harvest. Just as Snake Tongue was pondering, an unforeseen event occurred. The whistling tremors of the dust storm in the outside world suddenly intensified. It was also in this instant that the previously turbulent environment, which could barely be considered safe, was stripped clean. The veil of silence was pulled away. If time was rewound 2 hours ago, perhaps Snake Tongue would be looking forward to this result even in her dreams. But now, after a series of unforeseen events, Snake Tongue's extremely weak spirit-body core had already lost the ability to exist independently. As soon as it was exposed to the impact of the dust storm, it showed signs of disintegration. A tenth of a second later, Gong Chi used his aura to wrap around her, temporarily saving her life. However, this action was brimming with ominous intentions. She only heard Gong Chi say, "I've already unraveled your formula. Your value, yes, I can still make use of it one last time." Snake Tongue didn't have time to react. She didn't have the opportunity to curse or express her hatred. Gong Chi flicked his finger, and the spirit-body core wrapped in his aura was forcefully thrown into the dust storm. It quickly went far away. Chapter 790. Her final value was embodied here? Snake Tongue felt that it was absurd, but she also felt calm, as if she had finally reached her destination. Things had developed to this point, far exceeding the upper limit of her usefulness. Her repeated struggles had only resulted in this. Just like that, she was wrapped in a sandstorm of dust. It was as if she was in the turbulent flow of fate. She drifted with the waves until she reached the top. But in reality, her fate had been controlled by someone else from beginning to end. The temporary protective cover set up by Gong Chi determined the length of the final part of her life. The protective cover was firm. Even under the assault of the chaotic domain fragments of the laws, it was only slowly worn away. It was to buy as much time as possible for Gong Chi to escape. At the same time, it was sensitive. It was closely linked to Snake Tongue's soul structure. When the protective cover shattered, Snake Tongue would inevitably be destroyed along with it. Gong Chi was certain that there was an unknown connection between Snake Tongue and Luo Nan. Therefore, he used Snake Tongue to mislead Luo Nan's tracking direction. Of course, Luo Nan might not fall for it, but as long as he hesitated for a moment, a bit more time would be good. Snake Tongue saw through Gong Chi's scheme, but it didn't matter. She just waited quietly like this. The legendary memories and repentance before her death never appeared. She had long since weakened to the point where she couldn't even bear her memories. Her thoughts and emotions flowed without limit. Even Snake Tongue herself didn't know what her thoughts and state of mind would be in the next moment. She believed that her candle-like life was about to disappear without a trace in this state. But at this time, Luo Nan's face inexplicably appeared in the lake of her heart. The relief sculpture of a human face pieced together by domain fragments, under the influence of her chaotic thoughts and emotions, transformed into a demonic god burning amidst the boundless space and time. The demonic god possessed a malevolent and sinister body, a lustrous and dazzling color. But in the end, all the elements settled in the pair of deep eyes that had never changed from beginning to end. They slowly became clear. Snake Tongue didn't know why she would allow this face to completely occupy her mind in the final moments of her life. Perhaps she had even unwittingly given away this little bit of autonomy. Snake Tongue gave up on everything. She allowed time to wrap around her as she indifferently advanced. She followed the most fundamental laws of the universe, gradually changing from order to disorder. The protective barrier began to disintegrate. The structure of the spirit body was also implicated, collapsing from the very foundation. Perhaps if time flowed a bit more, then the medium known as Snake Tongue would completely disintegrate from the material world and perish. But under these circumstances, Luo Nan, the demonic god that coiled and converged at the bottom of her heart, still existed. He existed steadily, not shifting from any change. Is it not a creation of my mind? Wouldn't it rot? It exists independently of me? Or could it be that at this moment, when I'm about to collapse and perish, there's still a corner of my consciousness that's supporting me? Luo Nan, no, that demonic god, has been paying attention to me from beginning to end. Has he used a portion of his power on my side? If that was the case, do I still have a chance? There was still a chance of survival? Snake Tongue's already stagnant train of thought seemed to have come alive. It was like a candle that had already burned out, a spark in the ashes of a fire, struggling to not be extinguished. It was because of the endless desire for life that was hidden deep in the embers and had never been completely eliminated. At this moment, Snake Tongue suddenly understood. In the end, she was unwilling. She still wanted to live. She wanted to live. She wasn't willing to give up even the slightest possibility, the slightest trace of hope. She was already unable to rely on her own strength to continue living. Then she would plead and beg. Even if it was lowly and ugly, it was fine as long as she lived. Therefore, her will that was on the verge of collapse burned in this way. Save me. My lord, I beg you to save me. I'm willing to give up everything. Everything. I'm willing to endure everything. Everything. I just ask to be entrusted in your shadow. I want to have a place to kneel and worship under your feet. I only have this humble request. I worship you as the ruler of life. I will listen to your judgment. Save me. Save me. The protective barrier silently collapsed, and the chaotic power of the sandstorm seeped in. The structure of her spirit body was like a sandcastle under the tide. It changed beyond recognition in an instant. Snake Tongue didn't have the strength to resist. Her consciousness suddenly dimmed. But in this instant of annihilation, the last clear thought that remained was, save me. This thought flickered, trembled, rose, and fell. It could be extinguished at any moment. But in the end, it still survived. Moreover, it really did connect with fuel. It recovered its brightness little by little. Snake Tongue woke up. Her soul fire supported her consciousness. Little by little, she recovered the fragments of her memories and pieced them together to form a vein of thought. Then, she discovered that she was currently attached to a thin thread that was hard to distinguish between real and fake. She was hanging alone in the nothingness. Soon, bright and scorching rays of light spilled down, drawing her in to look up. Above her was a dense interweaving, three-dimensional, and complex network. It was like a spider web, but it was hundreds of times more complicated. And at the core of the spider web was a blazing sun. It was so dazzling that it was hard to look directly at it. Even the red light that was spitting out from the edges covered the entire spider web structure. At this moment, the thin thread that was attached to Snake Tongue was hanging down from the spider web structure. It was directly connected to the spider web and pulled her closer and closer to the spider web. During this process, the sound of crashing could be heard without end. Some were extremely far away, coming from the upper core of the spider web structure. Some were extremely close, belonging to the thin thread that pulled her in. This thin thread was an exquisite and tough chain. It directly penetrated her mind, firmly locking her down without leaving any leeway. As a curse master of orthodox origins in the shrine, Snake Tongue quickly understood. Her mind was submerged in an extremely symbolic space of consciousness. She clearly understood where she belonged, and she experienced the fundamental restraints and corresponding status she received from the demon god Luo Nan's system. In other words, she was still here. She was still alive. Snake Tongue laughed loudly. She didn't care about the chains binding her mind. She didn't care about the spider web and the sun that grew closer and closer. She didn't care about the unpredictable fate that awaited her. She just indulged herself, laughing happily in this space of consciousness. Her surging emotions were burning. But right now, she had the qualifications. She had the capital. She could wantonly waste and vent her emotions unless the demon god that controlled her life ordered her to stop. Luo Nan didn't stop her, and Snake Tongue was finally done laughing. She got closer and closer to the sun web. The closer she got, the more complex and precise the structure of the spider web she could see. The number of connected nodes increased. She had felt lonely before because she was in the outermost region. She was far from the center. In fact, there was another chain hanging down from the spider web in this outermost region aside from the thread she was at. It just so happened to intersect with her thread and cast into the depths of the void. It was unknown where or who it was connected to. Chapter 791. Gong Chi moved at high speed amidst the dust and sandstorm. He didn't stop to rest for over 10 hours. He needed to use his extraordinary domain to integrate the chaotic and collapsing fragments of his domain. He needed to open up a path in the void where there was no path. He also needed to endure the destruction of his fleshly body and the damage to his foundation, which brought chaos and disturbance to his extraordinary domain. This undoubtedly increased his consumption, whether it was in terms of energy or mental strength. But Gong Chi gradually calmed down as time passed. Luo Nan had yet to catch up to him. Gong Chi had most likely thrown him off. Perhaps it was temporary, but he used this time to stabilize the negative effects of his fleshly body to the greatest degree. His combat strength had rebounded compared to the fiercest initial assault. He should be able to reach 60 to 70% of his peak. 60 to 70% of extraordinaries were still extraordinaries. Gong Chi was confident that he could deal with the vast majority of unforeseen events. Moreover, the Guardian on Volcano Island is enough to give Luo Nan and the power behind him a hard time. That old fox Abner should be able to mend the pen after the sheep is lost as long as he puts in a bit of effort. Gong Chi thought about many things in the span of over 10 hours. The changes in the situation on Earth were only a very small part of it. He spent most of his time and energy exploring and verifying the misty labyrinth environment. Moreover, he had more and more ideas. My initial judgment was correct, and there are no problems with the direction of my calculations. This shattered space has a close interference relationship with Earth's spacetime. The cloud world outside is very likely the product of this interference. Therefore, it possesses environmental conditions similar to Earth, but it is distorted and absurd. It seems boundless, but it is actually just a monotonous cycle of the structure of spacetime. Gong Chi also understood that there were still many unsolved mysteries within the cloud world. For example, the blood-colored monster apes that shuttled back and forth were already complete living bodies. Where they came from and where they belonged was completely unknown. But he wasn't a spacetime research expert. He wasn't a distortion scholar. He didn't rely on this to make a living. He just wanted to return to Earth's spacetime to deal with the chaotic situation. He only had this goal and nothing more. Once he caught his breath, he would uproot Luo Nan and the power behind him. He would even uproot the Xia City branch. Moreover, he would use the most vicious methods on Luo Nan's body. He would use them on all of Luo Nan's friends and family. He would let that little bastard truly experience what despair and regret were. Gong Chi showed signs of letting go of his thoughts and emotions. He suppressed them with great difficulty and comforted himself. Soon. The 4 clues and 4 formulas that he had found in succession were enough to express the interference relationship between the two spacetime on different levels. It was from these 4 formulas that he deduced that he discovered more clues and made a series of basic judgments. The structure of the interference between the two spaces was rather complicated. There could be 2 or 3 core interference zones, and they could change at any time. In other words, the two spaces were in a state of activity relative to each other. Sometimes they were more closely connected, and sometimes they were separated. The easiest way to return to Earth was, of course, to find the core interference zone and destroy the relatively fragile barrier there. But it was not absolute. As long as he could control the basic structure of the interference, it was fine to be a little more on the periphery. It wasn't easy to identify 2 or 3 core interference zones. The 2 spacetime interference points were definitely not in a one-to-one correspondence. The slightest difference could make a huge difference. Comparatively speaking, the misty labyrinth was easier to deal with. After all, it was more intuitive, and he could observe how the domain fragments worked together. He would be able to find some clues. On the other hand, the spacetime of Earth was separated by a layer. There was no way to sense it. It was impossible to rely purely on calculations. Gong Chi's train of thought was quite open. He used some information outside of technology to make up for it. His train of thought was like this: did Luo Nan, a teenager, really have the ability to blaze a different path? The possibility of him inheriting the legacy of his elders was greater. He had studied Luo Nan's information before. Although it was relatively superficial, he still knew about Luo Nan's grandfather and father's research back in the wilderness. The information displayed the direction of their research and the main areas of activity. There was no need to talk about Xia City. There were also a few plateaus in the border region of the Eurasian Plate and the Indian Ocean Plate. The area around Spring City was the longest. Gong Qi first placed Xia City's priority on the back burner. He still did not know what role Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong played in this matter. Even though he was certain that Luo Nan was a protective puppy who did not report the matter of the Cloud World to the Xia City branch, he did not dare to gamble. After all, the resources that Luo Nan displayed far exceeded the upper limit that a young man should have. What if the Xia City branch really did participate? They would simply be surrounded and killed if they returned from there. Comparatively speaking, Spring City was the best entry point. If this interference zone truly existed. No, it certainly existed. Gong Qi had already circled back and forth in a designated suspicious area for 4 or 5 hours. The more he circled, the more excited he became. He felt that he was already very close. This was not an illusory feeling. This was real evidence. He raised his hand, and the bead of light wrapped in his aura floated up. It was similar to how he took care of Snake Tongue, but this time he was even more careful. There was a fragment within the bead of light. It was not something as high and mighty as a domain fragment. Instead, it had something similar to an insect's appendage. Fine, it was not similar. It was an insect's appendage. This was his greatest harvest after coming to this area. 5 hours ago, when Gong Qi discovered this toy, it was much more complete than it was now. At the very least, he could see what its true form looked like. Gong Qi was confident that he would be the first to capture this little toy as soon as it floated past his sensing range. He would absolutely not miss it. Hiss. The radiance of his spiritual body suddenly rippled. It seemed to resonate with the fine spatial ripples at the edge of his sensing range. Gong Qi quickly suppressed the throbbing in his heart. He stared closely at that area and silently covered it up. The operation of the dust storm in that area was slightly affected. A portion of the domain fragment lost speed and collided with the other fragments in the surroundings. Some bounced off each other, while others were stimulated to emit annihilating electric flames. Little by little, they accumulated and blossomed into an expanse of bright light in the void. The light quickly disappeared, but it annihilated the foreign species that had rushed in earlier into that area into ashes. But a mere second later, new foreign species crawled out from the fine spatial ripples. In the blink of an eye, they were engulfed by the sandstorm and involuntarily flung away. What awaited them was undoubtedly a destructive fate. But in this instant, Gong Qi had already approached quickly enough to determine the appearance, species, and origins of these little foreign species. Ants. Ant-like life forms. They were red and lustrous like blood and fire. Just based on their ability to struggle in this shattered space and the dust storm, it proved that they were no ordinary insects. There was a high probability that they belonged to a mutant species. Mutant species, ants, blood. The most famous of them all was naturally the fire god ant. That's right, it was the Spring City area's specialty, the fire god ant. Chapter 792. In the fine ripples, groups of Vulcan ants emerged one after another, and they were annihilated again and again. There were at least a few dozen groups of thousands of them, and only 1 or 2 lucky ones, like the evidence Gong Qi had captured before, escaped the interference zone of the domain fragments and the fine ripples of spacetime. They came out in one piece, but in the blink of an eye, they were swept away by the howling sandstorm and crushed in another form. Their actions were like moths flying into a flame. He had no idea what was going on. Gong Qi observed carefully, forcing himself to calm down. It took a great deal of willpower for him to hold back from rushing over at the first moment. But his mind kept turning. If even ants can pass through the interference point, there's no reason I can't pass through it. Alright, I need to calm down. Maybe it's just a tiny point. I need to widen it. What's on the other end of the interference point? He needed to investigate further. Actually, he could guess it. It was most likely a magma space. In recent years, research on Vulcan ants had been a very popular field. This kind of social aberrant population, aberrant nests that could be cultivated, and the mental level that could be raised through collective consciousness. There were too many things to ponder. Gong Chi searched his memory for relevant research papers, hoping to find more clues and verification from the habits of Vulcan ants. The problem was that no research had ever mentioned that Vulcan ants could actually penetrate the space-time barrier, reach a shattered space, and come in waves to die. For an aberrant population with strict social ethics, what was the meaning of such behavior? Most importantly, would it affect Gong Chi, who was in a hurry to return to Earth's spacetime? Just as he was pondering, the position of the spacetime interference point finally changed a little after thousands of Vulcan ants were annihilated. The source of the change was the remains of the Vulcan ant's shells. In terms of size, the Vulcan ant was considered rather large among the ant species. The different variants produced by each nest had an average length of 1.2 centimeters. The largest was even nearly 5 centimeters in size. But from a human's perspective, it was still not considered much, not to mention compared to the vast and boundless misty maze. However, when thousands of similar gadgets surged out in a short period of time and piled up the corpses, the adjectives such as tiny were no longer suitable. Although their bodies could not resist the erosion of the sandstorm, they turned the unfavorable situation bit by bit in an even more incredible way. When the crushed remains were piled up to a certain extent, Gong Chi actually felt a very obvious magic. Due to the piling up of these corpses, the fine ripples in the void became somewhat chaotic. However, the indistinct spacetime gap of the interference point was not affected. Instead, it expanded and stabilized. These fire god ants seemed to be using their own corpses to fill the trench. Their tiny shells carried amazing energy. Even if they were shattered, the energy would still remain. Also, under the effective effect of the group consciousness, they were reassembled and built at the bridgehead on the interference point of space and time. Although it was not yet completed, the prototype could already be seen. As long as there were no more major disturbances in the misty labyrinth, and the fire god ant colony had an endless supply of backup forces, it would most likely be completed. The mutant species were indeed peculiar and extraordinary. The material attributes of the individual and the mental level of the group were extremely efficient in integrating together. This was how they achieved such an astonishing result. This group of first-hand materials that could drive a mutant ecologist crazy was a small matter. What was truly decisive was the endlessly expanding and stabilizing narrow passageway that clearly connected Earth's spacetime with the misty labyrinth. Whether it was calculations or senses, they all verified the authenticity of the passageway. The heavens have not forsaken me. Gong Chi really could not hold it in any longer. The path of survival was within reach, but it had already consumed most of his mental strength. The bridgehead formed by piling up the corpses of the fire god ants was becoming more and more obvious. Its defense and interference rules were becoming more and more unyielding. While it was helping him resolve his problems, he could not help but worry. If this continued, it was hard to say what sort of situation the fire god ant colony would stir up. In the off chance it affected the spacetime structure of the interference point, it would result in the consequence of making a mistake of 1,000 miles. He could only ram his head into a wall. The fire god ant's strange and illogical behavior and the natural space of lava on the other side were completely unrelated to humans no matter how he looked at it. It had nothing to do with Luo Nan, who he feared the most. All he needed to do now was to return to Earth's spacetime and bypass the threats of Ouyang Chen and Wu Jiong. The sky was high and the sea was wide. Nothing could stop him. Go, go, go. When Gong Chi's mind was set, the yarn of silence displayed its miraculous effect. Gong Chi's spiritual body truly seemed to become a thin mist of nothingness under the wrapping of this strange item. His powerful extraordinary level power was hidden in formlessness. He was able to go against the flow of the narrow passageway constructed by the fire god ants. He intersected with the fire god ant colony that surged out, and he also made close contact with their group consciousness. He brushed past them. He was truly close to the fire god ant colony, and his senses were even more exquisite. This group of little things, whether they were alive or dead, did indeed have their own rules. The mental power formed by the group consciousness was both a commander and a glue. It dominated the entirety of the colony and each individual from life to death. If he were to substitute himself as an individual in this society, then it would truly be so tight that it would suffocate him. But if he were to observe it from a detached perspective, there was no lack of errors and omissions formed by low-level instincts. And this was the most natural state. It was precisely because of this that Gong Qi eliminated the risk and came over with peace of mind. However, he also carefully avoided disturbing them, afraid that something unexpected would happen. The space-time rift was a highly distorted structure. It was very difficult to quantify it with something like length. Gong Qi had to conform to the rules and regulations of the fire god ants, which took a lot of time. But when he truly moved out, he still deeply felt that all the hard work was worth it. The chaotic misty maze and the monotonous cloud world were completely left behind. What replaced them were more diverse and orderly structures and colors. In the hollow underground cavern, dark red lava gurgled, illuminating the surrounding cavern walls. It also illuminated the huge ant nest that was half-trapped inside. Dark black and dark red were the main colors, mixed with the bluish-gray pieces of the rock. The state of interweaving light and shadow was filled with natural liveliness and charm. "I'm back, I'm back." Gong Qi burst into laughter. His laughter surged in the underground lava area, stirring up waves. At this time, he was no longer afraid of anything. Even if there was a mutated nest next to him, it did not matter. Perhaps it was because of Gong Qi's impudence that in the fire god ant nest a dozen meters away, the billions of fire god ants that were working hard became restless. These movements and reactions were quickly reflected in their group consciousness. Restlessness and hostility were like sparks and oil colliding, igniting at the slightest touch. Hee, these little things. Gong Qi did not mind being like many research teams at all, coming to the center and bringing out the queen of the fire god ant colony as a captive to conduct in-depth research. From their behavior just now, they really had a lot of research value. But in the next second, his gaze turned to the fire god ant nest. He suddenly felt that something was wrong. Why did the style of this nest look so familiar? Also, the group consciousness of the fire god ants that had already ignited did not rush up to kill like the low-level creatures. Instead, it was accumulating and circulating the heat. In a breath's time, its influence and interference pattern had already exceeded the range of Gong Qi's judgment. It spread rapidly to a wider area, almost like a prairie fire. Boom. Boom boom. The lava beneath him stirred. Sparks from the group consciousness of the fire god ants splashed. The already burning fluid seemed to have peeled off a layer of old skin. The dark red layer of light on the surface, under the effect of the explosively rising heat, split into pieces. What replaced it was an even brighter and more dazzling yellow-white light. The entire underground cavern was illuminated as bright as day by the sudden burst of light. It was so bright that Gong Qi's spirit body was penetrated by the light and became a lot fainter. Gong Qi looked at all of this in a daze. He watched as the temperature of the lava rose abnormally. Very quickly, it exceeded the normal upper limit of the natural world. From 800 to 900 degrees, it shot up to 3,000 to 4,000 degrees. And the huge pressure that created all of this sank from the mental plane to the physical plane. Very quickly, it surged back up, forming a wonderful two-way cycle. And pressure and temperature, mental and physical, were perfectly unified, forming a stable and solid closed loop. This series of changes originated from the effect of the fire god ants group consciousness. But in the process of this effect, there was clearly an even stronger core. Gong Qi finally reacted. He locked onto his vision and senses, staring at the huge ant nest in the turbulent lava space that connected the top and bottom of the cavern. Under the effect of high temperature and high pressure, parts of the ant nest structure could not withstand it and fell off. However, it wrapped around the base of the coarse stone pillars. Even if it stood in the hottest lava, it did not change shape or shake at all. Furthermore, it was absorbing the high-temperature fluid that was close to being in a gaseous and liquid state, causing it to flow through the structure of the ant nest. It became a circulating bloodline. The energy and chi activity thus linked up and continued to operate and upgrade. The ant nest was like a mountain, and the lava was like water. Yet this landscape was as malevolent as hell. It integrated the group consciousness of billions of fire god ants and gave it an even more warped and restless quality. More importantly, there was a higher level of power here: blood, blood, blood. Fire, fire, fire. Gong Qi's expression changed. Blood flame order, do you have a death wish? Although that was what he said, under the extreme environment of high temperature and high pressure, the fanatical and devout power of faith was like a prairie fire. It filled all the space of consciousness that Gong Qi could sense. It possessed direct lethality, but it also contained a deep and violent venom. It burned, eroded, and entangled without care. Even Gong Qi had to fend it off in a fluster for a moment. At this moment, an ethereal voice of laughter came through the air. Chapter 793. It was a woman's voice, but this wasn't the main point. It was somewhat familiar, but it didn't matter. What truly tormented him was the information contained within the laughter. Especially when the words, Mr. Luo, came out. The 10 or so words that naturally extended behind it transformed into sharp knives. They sliced back and forth in his heart, forcefully carving out a face. Luo Nan. The young face transformed from the human face relief was carved into his heart. It gazed coldly at him, seemingly mocking this old man who refused to accept reality. Gong Qi's mind was in chaos at this moment. It could not be cut off, it could not be extinguished. The piercing words were admittedly a primer. The more practical reason was that this lava cavern had already transformed into a domain controlled by the laws of the Blood Soul Temple. It originated from the extreme melancholy and despairing power of the battlefield. It possessed a powerful ability to infect and assimilate. The Vulcan ant nest was vaguely the structure of the Blood Soul Temple. Gong Qi still vaguely remembered the relevant information. The physical structure of the Blood Soul Temple was something that the Blood Flame Order had not been able to accomplish even at its peak, let alone after it had split apart. Now that it had taken form, it had become a preset battlefield. It had been set up as a trap, and it had been set up specifically for him. It was simply shameful. Everyone else would suffer interference and suppression within this domain, but the Blood Flame Order could obtain an inexhaustible amount of power from within. And there was only one woman who could control this domain in the main and branches of the Blood Flame Order. Gong Qi forcefully suppressed the fluctuations in his heart and shifted his gaze. Diagonally below him, in the boiling lava surrounding the fire god ant nest, a slender woman was slowly rising up. She was not wearing a single piece of clothing. There were no clothes in this world that could preserve such a high temperature that could melt gold and iron. The same was true for a normal human body. But this woman had indeed risen up from the lava. She had a calm demeanor. Mrs. Halder. Gong Qi's mind went berserk when he saw this scene. He spoke coldly after half a second had passed. Since when did the Blood Flame Order become a lapdog under the feet of a little doll? The only response he received was a strange smile. When Mrs. Halder lifted the corner of her lips, a fiery red light shot out from her facial features and even her delicate and thin skin. It was as if she was engulfed by raging flames from the inside out. She was about to turn into ashes in the next moment. But in reality, she wasn't. The red light gushing out from her body was actually a sign of the high temperature and high pressure, as well as the complete mixing of blood essence and vitality. In Gong Qi's eyes, this was undoubtedly the interference control level of an extraordinary. No, not control. Gong Qi's eyes were very sharp. He quickly discovered that Lady Halder didn't put any effort into balancing the internal and external forces at all. This woman had chosen to be a great Satan, allowing the structure of the Blood Soul Temple to naturally suppress the situation. Her thoughts were purified and condensed, forming a sharp light that swam through the destructive heat, messing with the fragile balance at will. Are you crazy? You are under the control of others? Why would you risk your life for Luo Nan? Now, Gong Qi seriously needed an explanation to understand the core logic behind this series of unforeseen events. But what he had been waiting for was Lady Halder smiling and pouncing at him. The lava cavern glowed brightly with red light, and the temperature inside had clearly risen again. The high temperature and high pressure environment did not cause much harm to Gong Qi's spirit body, but under the manipulation of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, the storm formed by the reverse interference abyssal region still posed a considerable threat. Lady Halder was the first ablatum of the Blood Flame Order. Although her strength had yet to reach the extraordinary level, she had the support of the Blood Soul Temple's configuration in the abyssal region. She could not be underestimated. On the other hand, Gong Qi's fleshly body had been damaged, and his foundation in the abyssal region had collapsed. He had no choice but to be careful. What the hell was going on? Gong Qi was guarding against the storm stirred up by the abyssal region, but what Lady Halder was pointing at was merely her mental strength. This mental strength, which was hard to distinguish between real and fake, had clearly gone through inconceivable tempering. It had condensed into an unparalleled edge, and it chopped down without regard for anything. Hiss. Gong Qi's defensive mode and offensive direction were completely different. Gong Qi's spirit body was nearly pierced through by the sharp edge. Even though he dodged quickly, the structure of his spirit body seemed to have been scorched by raging flames. There were faint signs of warping and floating. This was the heart incineration blade. Gong Qi quickly grasped the core of Lady Halder's secret offensive technique, and his mind became a bit chaotic. He clearly knew that this secret technique had been publicized to the world long ago, and that many B-rank powers were cultivating it, but he still immediately associated it with Wu Jiong. Luo Nan, Lady Halder. It wouldn't be strange if there was another person behind them. At this time, Lady Halder chopped down once more. She really did treat herself as a fleshly body, and she was burning her blood and energy. Her fleshly body was on the brink of life and death. She attacked in a direct manner, without holding back at all. Scram! Gong Qi's emotions exploded. The green-gray essence energy that was intertwined with his life and energy swept down from the outer layer of his spirit body. It connected with Lady Halder's mental strength. This attack truly held nothing back. It was like 10,000 years of frigid ice in the polar regions. It forcefully froze the heart incineration blade and seized the opportunity to pierce through. It wanted to break Lady Halder's fragile balance and end the battle quickly. The red light was a bit chaotic, and the green-gray energy charged back, polluting the originally transparent domain of the Blood Soul Temple. It even seeped into Lady Halder's body. Lady Halder's body froze, and the old scar on her cheek seemed to tear open once more. The flames were like vipers as they slithered across her cheek. It was like a second flame had been lit. After a brief moment of chaos, the penetrating red light erupted once more. It forcefully expelled the corrosive power of Gong Qi's essence energy, and it charged forth once more. The green-gray essence energy and the sharp edge instantly intersected and separated. In the blink of an eye, they coiled around each other and collided. In the time it took for an ordinary person to take a breath, the two had exchanged over 30 blows. Later on, the high-frequency vibrations formed by the collision nearly tore apart the domain of the Blood Soul Temple's structure. A small portion of the lava cavern had already collapsed, and this was only the result of the attack on the mental plane interfering with the material plane. Suddenly, there was a long hiss. Lady Halder's body was struck solid by the enormous force. Her entire body was like a fiery meteor as she smashed heavily into the high-temperature lava. She was less than half a meter away from the physical structure of the Blood Soul Temple. The fiery glow of the lava instantly engulfed over half of this structure, and quite a few fragments were smashed down. However, the main body remained majestic and unmoving. What a pity! Gong Qi cried to himself. The most direct method was to break the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and destroy its foundation on the material plane. However, Lady Halder was quite strange. She was still able to forcefully control herself even in such a passive situation. Her momentum was thwarted, but she did not fall into chaos. Of course, even if she had the support of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, she would certainly pay a price for clashing with an extraordinary at the level of an architect. Gong Qi could see that Lady Halder's body had truly ignited with flames. The flesh of her chest, abdomen, and limbs were charred black, and the outline of her body had shrunk in an extremely bizarre manner. Burning essence energy and burning flesh. How ruthless. Gong Qi felt his heart burn as he watched Lady Halder's aura rise and fall. The one before him was Lady Halder, but he was thinking about something else in his heart. Just what version of the bewitching curse did Luo Nan use to make the head of a religion risk her life to fight? If things were to continue like this, then even if he broke through the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, his losses would far exceed his estimations. Chapter 794. Gong Qi had a certain realization. He was within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. The operation of the opponent's power and the corresponding rules had already formed a closed loop. He was fighting in the domain of an enemy extraordinary. This was a strategic defeat. The basic starting conditions were already very difficult to change or reverse. Under these circumstances, while enduring the corresponding pressure, he had to plan a corresponding counterattack. He had to start from the tactical details and do his best to seize back the initiative. Taking the initiative was not the same as charging in and attacking. On the contrary, Gong Qi's attitude was more conservative. The greatest benefit of a conservative attitude was that he could maintain a cool head, restrain his consumption, and do his best to precisely allocate resources in order to deal with the possible changes in the future. In theory, this should be the case. However, Gong Qi felt that this wasn't the case after a round of confrontation. On the contrary, the consumption was clearly lower than what he had predicted. The greatest possibility was that the high temperature and high pressure of the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and the corresponding law environment could form an even stronger suppression on him, creating an even greater consumption. Moreover, this was the case. Gong Qi didn't take advantage of the situation to pursue an attack. He stared at Lady Halder, observing the changes in her state. The strength of the opponent's blood and energy was declining, but her internal cohesion and sharpness didn't decrease. Oh, her blood and energy were replenished from the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. Was she planning on fighting a protracted battle? No, that wasn't right. This woman's motives weren't simple at all on the mental level. Gong Qi spoke half mockingly and half probingly. The body and mind are like blades, the domain is like a furnace, and I'm here to stir up the wind and hammer. Not a bad idea. You want me to coordinate with you? It's not up to you. Gong Qi was stupefied again. He didn't know what kind of attitude he should take. Lady Halder was smiling at this time. She completely disregarded her own burning flesh and her damaged state. She pounced forward once more. She didn't control the domain of the Blood Soul Temple and instead engaged in a killing style. This sort of unsettled ambition. Did she look down on the first oblatum of her order? It was truly absurd to the point where one couldn't laugh. Gong Qi didn't care about the future of the Blood Flame Order, but why did he have to encounter such an expert who didn't care about fame and position, who didn't even care about life? For a time, Gong Qi was a bit annoyed from being pestered, but his train of thought was still clear. Luo Nan had set up an ambush for him here, so Luo Nan most likely had a backup plan. After all, Mrs. Halder was barely qualified to be used as a sniper, but she wasn't quite qualified to be the decisive character. It must be known that the might of the domain of the Blood Soul Temple was extraordinary. If he continued to delay here, it would be fine if that kid Luo Nan chased after him. But if he waited for Ouyang Chen, Wu Jiong, and the like to take action, then his life would most likely end here. But then again, if the Transcendents wanted to set up an ambush, why did they have to complicate matters and have Madame Halder take the lead? This was an unnecessary move. The logic behind this was simply too confusing. Just who was behind Luo Nan? What kind of dirty tricks were they going to play? When is he going to use that move? Gong Qi's thoughts were intertwined and he found it hard to calm down. He was even more unwilling to tangle with Lady Halder. This woman's willpower is commendable, but strength is what matters. She wants to rely on the domain of the Blood Soul Temple to fight a protracted battle and sharpen her blade? Does she really think my extraordinary domain is just for show? With a single thought, the curtain unfurled, and smoke filled the air. The thin smoke was unremarkable within the forge-like domain of the Blood Soul Temple, but the veins of laws that came from the rank of an extraordinary were real. Since Gong Qi's foundation in the Abyss District had been damaged and collapsed, he no longer had the main axis of dispatching. His originally advantageous extraordinary domain had enormous flaws, so he couldn't help but be cautious. Therefore, he didn't take the initiative to activate his domain to interfere. He just wanted to observe and examine the situation, and then take the initiative to strike later. Now was his chance. Even though Gong Qi's own structure of laws was already full of flaws, he could still easily and delightfully destroy them. Within the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, the battle circle surrounding the two was inexplicably cool. Visually, the smoke curtain was faintly discernible, but its existence truly disrupted the transmission of energy. It caused a clear difference in temperature between the inside and outside of the curtain. Of course, it was impossible to completely isolate it. But under the strangulation of the chaotic laws, Gong Qi was 100% certain that he could destroy the stability of the transmission tunnel and disrupt Madame Halder's food supply route. He could pull the rug from under her. Huh! Madame Halder's qi and blood surged into the heavens. She revealed her sharpness, and a bright light slashed through the air. Unexpectedly, she wasn't affected at all, and her aura flourished even more. When it was Gong Qi's turn, his mind was in a daze. The heart-burning blade really did slash at him on the mental plane. A portion of his spiritual body structure burned and evaporated. Even if he didn't lose his foundation, he was still injured. One slash, Madame Halder muttered softly. Just by looking at her smile, there was no malevolence in battle. Instead, it was like she was playing cards with her best friend during afternoon tea. Very good. Gong Qi couldn't care less about this small injury. He activated his extraordinary domain, the curtain, and retracted it. There was even a greenish-gray stream of energy circulating within it. It almost formed a dark cloud in the lava cavern, forcefully distorting the structure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He no longer held back in his methods. It was completely a battle between extraordinaries. Their domains would collide and suppress each other. Originally, he wanted to conserve his strength to deal with an unknown enemy, but the omen on Madame Halder's side wasn't good, it was rising. Gong Qi's heart twitched once more. No matter how miraculous the structure of the Blood Soul Temple's domain was, the interference and distortion of the two domains should have long since messed up the energy transmission tunnel. However, Madame Halder was clearly burning and consuming a large amount of qi and blood at every moment. Yet, her recovery process was uninterrupted, undisturbed, and undiminished. Although she didn't recover all at once, the steady rhythm of the night rain rising without him realizing it formed a strong contrast with Gong Qi's unrestrained methods and his unstoppable consumption of qi and blood. There was something fishy going on. Gong Qi stared at Madame Halder and sensed his own body. Comparing the two, the fuzzy feeling gradually became clearer. It wasn't the Blood Soul Temple's domain at work. At the very least, it wasn't the main structure, it was just a cover. Madame Halder charged forward again without any fear. Every time she slashed out, she burned her qi and blood without holding back. But no matter how she tossed and turned, there would always be a return, in a timely manner. No, it was an immediate injection. There was no internal or external conduction or transformation process. It was as if her body had a blood return device. However, when Gong Qi eliminated the information interference of the Blood Soul Temple's domain and compared Madame Halder's blood recovery with his own consumption, he clearly sensed a certain relationship between the ebb and flow of the fluctuations. Is she drawing my blood? No, she doesn't have the ability to do so. There's still a middle link. In other words, there might be a middle link. While drawing my blood, the extracted power is converted into universal energy, and then injected into Madame Halder's body? What a joke! Gong Chi found it hard to accept such an absurd guess. Chapter 795. After a few seconds of absent-mindedness, Gong Chi seemed to hear something. The subtle sound seemed to be hidden behind the cries and praises of the Blood-Soul Temple domain, blood, 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 fire, fire, fire. It was even more distant and even more chaotic. Gong Chi's thoughts traced upwards, and the degree of chaos continued to rise. It was as if he had arrived at the center of a metropolis. There were streams of people everywhere. He closed his eyes, and he could hear the clamor of human voices echoing at all times. He was clearly spying on Yue, but on this level, he was practically drowned out by the clamor of sound. Fortunately, he was rich in experience, and he promptly adjusted the wrong direction of his senses. He no longer pondered and analyzed the details of the clamor of voices. Instead, he strove to capture the general characteristics of the chaos. Luo Nan. Even if it was Luo Nan, that damned young man. Just what sort of standard did he use to gather such an enormous flood of information? Actually, if one were to seriously consider it, there was a thread to follow. The domain of the Blood-Soul Temple, the burning of Mrs. Halder's blood and energy, the extreme beliefs of blood and fire. There had to be some connection hidden behind these materialized things. Was it the psychic power of the believers, the call, the prayer? No, it was something even more primitive. It had yet to form concrete logic. Then it was emotion. What sort of emotion was it? It was fear. Bit by bit, Gong Chi analyzed and sensed until he captured the most crucial clue. His train of thought suddenly became clear and broadened. That's right. It was fear. On the chaotic information plane, there existed the terror and panic of not knowing what to do. There was also the ruthlessness and savagery of a cornered beast. These two reactions were nearly polar, yet they were unified on the most essential core. All of this was piled up, operating, and pressurized on this hidden plane. It was like a high-temperature furnace that was endlessly adding fuel. Every participant was consciously and unconsciously speeding up this process, even if this required them to pay endlessly and consume energy until they became weak and dazed. Such matters were not rare in the inner world. Gong Chi used his experience to quickly determine the nature of the matter. Sacrifice. Luo Nan was conducting a sacrificial ritual. This sort of ritual used a so-called high-dimensional structure to exchange a low-level resource for a high-level resource. Mrs. Halder was cooperating with him. Or to be more precise, she was the one who knew and carried out this ritual. The Blood Flame Order was a secret organization that was best at utilizing extreme emotions such as fear and anger. The Blood-Soul Temple was the most efficient organization in utilizing such emotions. However, according to Gong Chi's previous senses, the Blood-Soul Temple was not the main body. It was in a subsidiary position, perhaps only a pillar in the structure. This pillar was also burning furiously right now. It was essentially no different from those who had sacrificed their essence, blood and vitality in fear and fury. No, it should be said that it burned more fiercely and more extreme. The chi-chi sound of the airflow was not only in the material plane, but also in Gong Chi's mind. Every rise and fall carried a scorching sharpness. Madame Halder's attack seemed to have no end, and the sharpness of her attack seemed to have no upper limit. At least until her body and vitality were completely incinerated. Gong Chi forced her back again and again, slamming her against the stone walls of the cave and into the lava. He shattered her bones and imprisoned her vital energy. However, this overwhelming advantage was unable to grind away Madame Halder's most essential core. She had already abandoned everything. Only her heart shone with an extreme sharpness. This sort of situation shouldn't have appeared. Her mental willpower was as firm as diamond, but it was unable to resist the decay and collapse of her material foundation. But today, Madame Halder brought out the most extreme and cruel method. She had abandoned everything, and she had used the most brilliant method to abandon everything. She had placed herself, and perhaps even the entire system of the Blood Flame Order, on the altar constructed by Luo Nan. She carried out a sacrifice in exchange for support that far exceeded the limits of her abilities. This was, without a doubt, a gamble. Even if Madame Halder was still alive after this battle, she would basically be half-cooked. She would spend the rest of her life on a sickbed, a life worse than death. Unless she could seize the spiritual opportunity in this battle and make a breakthrough, becoming an extraordinary. She could modify and reconstruct the structure of her body. Why was she so confident in Luo Nan? As it turned out, her confidence was rewarded. She abandoned everything in exchange for the limitless potential to break through all shackles. Compared to the force of impact on the material plane, Madame Halder's will was tempered to a peerless sharpness. Every time they clashed, even if her attacks were blasted into disarray, Gong Qi would suffer the cuts of her sharp will. Distracting thoughts rose one after another, and it became harder and harder for his mind to harmonize. Of course, this wasn't just the effect of Madame Halder's attacks. Gong Qi really didn't understand. It was fine if Madame Halder was willing to sacrifice herself, but why was he unwittingly falling into the trap as well? Was it because of the pull of the battle's energy, the mutual attacks? No. As an extraordinary, the energy around Gong Qi's body was a body of its own. It possessed its own rules. He was the only one who assimilated others. He shouldn't be easily drawn into another system. At least, this was the case on the level of energy manipulation. But if he eliminated all of this, he would think deeper and more primitive. Using fear as the foundation for the standard of sacrifice meant that he himself fulfilled the requirements. Was he, in fear? Gong Qi instinctively wanted to cut off this thought, but the illusory yet real connection of energy within the domain of the Blood-Soul Temple and the corresponding rational analysis told him, there was no point in deceiving himself. That's right. He was afraid. In the misty labyrinth, he was afraid of Luo Nan's series of plans and the gradual realization of Luo Nan's firm execution ability. In the domain of the Blood-Soul Temple, he was afraid of Madame Halder's extreme willpower to abandon everything. Even if this woman's goal wasn't pure, through the method of sacrifice, she formed a perfect fusion with Luo Nan's goal. Observing the enemy was like looking into a mirror. When the enemy's design was flawless, the flaws on his side were reflected particularly clearly. No matter how much Gong Qi denied it, he was afraid in the end. He was afraid of defeat. He was afraid of death. He was afraid of cutting off his path forward. Yet all of this was concealed under the shameful mentality of being thwarted by a junior. He consoled himself and deceived himself. There was a flaw in his heart, but he was unaware of it. This gave the other side an opportunity to take advantage of him. I have to be steady. Gong Qi shouted to himself. The light of spiritual wisdom illuminated the unbearable corner of his heart. He felt terrible, but he was far from being in a hopeless situation. Thinking about it seriously, Luo Nan tossed and turned so much, one step after another. Wasn't it all for the sake of creating a flaw in Gong Qi's heart and baiting him? But Gong Qi was an extraordinary. What was it that gave Luo Nan the confidence to construct a framework to trap extraordinaries? What level of knowledge and power was that? From top to bottom, there were nearly 100 extraordinaries in the inner world. They represented the highest level of martial power on Earth. Gong Qi had been Deputy Secretary General for several decades. He had gratitude and grudges, hatred and friendship with these people. He was truly able to count them like the back of his hand. Right now, he used the most rational and objective state of mind to go through the list of these people and the powers they belonged to. From the Ability User Society to the 3 Great Secret Orders. From the big shots who sat on the ground and divided the spoils, to the wandering heroes. Then, the answer he obtained was none. Not a single powerful person or power that had connections to Luo Nan, who had grudges with him, who had the strength and qualifications to set up a killing trap. This was normal. Otherwise, extraordinaries wouldn't be the peak combat power of the world. Gong Chi had toiled painstakingly for several decades in the ability user society. There was no meaning in that. So, calm down. Don't scare yourself. Gong Chi shouted to himself once more. Even though Luo Nan had constructed these structures, he really couldn't understand them. The complex and profound details hidden deep beneath the simple principles of sacrifice were still daunting to look at. But if Luo Nan really did have an overwhelming advantage, why would he need to do such complex preparatory work? This was more like a dazzling display of deterrence. It was an exquisite but limited method. He had experience in dealing with such methods. You don't have the chance. Suddenly, a voice cut in. After a long time, Mrs. Halder finally took the initiative to speak to him. Her throat was roasted by the high temperature. It was hoarse and unpleasant to listen to, but it was like the final verdict. It was very ear-piercing. You are the first oblatum, yet you destroy the order for your own selfish desires. You evil woman, you dare to disturb my mind. Gong Chi's reply went straight to the root of the problem after reconstructing his mental state. It was much sharper. And the corresponding method was even more straightforward and fierce. The ashen cloud suddenly boiled and expanded as it faced Mrs. Halder's flying bloody light. It towered high like a cliff, and its color darkened. It was like a cumulonimbus cloud in summer. It was bloated and enormous, and its top crystallized. It forcefully resisted the high temperature of the Blood Soul Temple's domain, forming a powerful counteracting force. The hazy cloud was like a pillar that could smash the heavens. It forcefully split apart the foundation of the laws of the Blood Soul Temple's domain on the material plane. It painted this land of lava with a completely rebellious color. It also turned the most active and resolute woman into an insignificant reptile. The rumble of the collapsing airflow directly suppressed the rumbling of the boiling and exploding lava. It was as if a snowstorm had come from beyond the heavens. It crushed the rock strata who knew how deep it was, and a bone-chilling coldness descended. The forceful distortion and interference of the extraordinary domain suppressed the rules of the Blood Soul Temple's domain. The other was the all-out attack of an extraordinary. Mrs. Halder was blasted flying once more. Gong Chi's mental state had made a decision, and he had finally achieved enough pressure on the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He destroyed the relevant environment, and a portion of the force even pierced through the structure of the domain and landed on the periphery. The lava cavern began to collapse, and the passageway leading to the ant nests suffered the attack. Tens of thousands of Vulcan ants were annihilated into ashes every second. The Vulcan ant group consciousness, which was an important support for the Blood Soul Temple's domain, also suffered the attack. Gong Chi was confident that he could completely shatter the Blood Soul Temple's domain after another 2 or 3 rounds of attacks of this level. More importantly, Gong Chi gained a more detailed understanding of the environment he faced as the extraordinary domains interfered and collided with each other. First, Luo Nan's entangling net frame construction was much more ingenious than Gong Chi's second judgment. Although Luo Nan's previous attacks had already disturbed the Blood Soul Temple's domain that supported Mrs. Halder, the deeper layers of incorporeal frames and restraints still towered silently. They were simultaneously erected on the material and mental planes. They seemed incorporeal yet incorporeal. No matter how the lava surged and the storm wreaked havoc in the abyssal region, they were not affected. Was this really Luo Nan's doing? It didn't look like it. It really didn't look like it. Such a construction, such a penetrating research, such a deep thought, and such an ingenious frame faintly surpassed the level of the abyssal region. It probed towards an even higher level. According to Gong Chi's understanding, perhaps only powerful people like that old ghost Abner or the leaders of the 3 great secret orders had the qualifications to touch upon this. If this really was the case. Bah! Wasn't this going against the logic of just being smooth? Then this was some sort of result that had yet to enter the scope of the inner world's attention. Luo Nan already had the cloud world, so having such a high-end structure was nothing. As for how Luo Nan was going to support the foundation of this structure, to allow it to exist and operate, this was a difficult problem that could only be solved at the end of the matter. Compared to this difficult problem that was hard to explain, Gong Chi discovered a second point that made him relax a bit. He cast aside his fear and stretched out his mental senses after smashing the Blood Soul Temple's domain. He did not discover Luo Nan's second trump card. Yes. Aside from the sacrificial structure that was so exquisite that it was unreal, there were no other extraordinary level powers within the range of his senses. Luo Nan, this young man, really only used Lady Halder and the Blood Soul Temple system as his final method of intercepting and killing him. Or perhaps it was a hook to pull him into a trap. Was this an extraordinary self-confidence, or was this a compromise made out of helplessness? Or perhaps there was a dangerous enemy that possessed absolute patience, preparing an even more fatal ambush from afar? None of this was important. The structure of Gong Qi's pupils in his spirit body was infected by the greenish-gray essence energy. A thick pillar of cloud of the same color wrapped around his tyrannical laws and will. It collided with the domain of the Blood Soul Temple once more, emitting an earth-shaking rumble. A second attack without any misgivings. The entire lava cavern swayed and swayed. Flames burst forth chaotically. Gong Qi's top priority was no longer to delve into the details of the enemy's mentality. This was because the expanded mental sense network marked out a narrow but absolutely safe area for him. With this distance as a buffer, Gong Qi was confident that he could escape unscathed even if there were powerful enemies lying in ambush in the indiscernible outer region. After all, he possessed the top-notch teleportation technique in the world. As long as he destroyed the enormous source of interference that was the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, he could make the surrounding space-time environment relatively stable. Even if it was only for a short second, it would be enough for him to escape 1,000 kilometers away. Before, Luo Nan had used the Cloud World, the Mist Maze, and the domain of the Blood Soul Temple to suppress Gong Qi's ability. But now, it was impossible for Luo Nan to return to these two damned places. The remaining source of interference that seemed troublesome could no longer be called troublesome without the most dreadful potential threat. Yes, it couldn't. The greenish-gray cumulonimbus cloud suddenly swayed for a moment. The upper layer isolated the high temperature and pressure. The cloud layer spontaneously condensed at the top. Perhaps the appearance of the cloud layer was too similar to certain meteorological conditions in the natural world. Crackling sparks of electricity flashed at the front where the low-temperature cloud layer and the high-temperature domain made close contact. Gong Qi's pupils were already immersed in greenish-gray light. They flickered with a glimmer, then froze. The light above the cloud layer only flickered for a brief moment. But at this moment, it was precisely these minute sparks of electricity that caused a certain inauspicious shadow to reveal a bit of its silhouette. It was still growing. It was still climbing. It was like a tree that twisted and struggled its way out of the crevice of hell. Every time it manifested, it represented the growth of multiple dimensions. Length, surface area, volume, aura intensity, power level. No, this wasn't growth. This was an explosive proliferation. Gong Qi was certain that he had captured the existence of his adversary in time. The adversary was right on the front where his extraordinary domain distorted and interfered with the domain of the Blood Soul Temple. The adversary was close at hand, and the adversary could interfere at any time. He really did react. Due to the ominous feeling in his heart, he had the thought of nipping the thread in the bud. His methods were fierce and straightforward. This was the third attack. It was slightly inferior to the previous one, but its subtlety far surpassed it. The undulating energy within that region was completely frozen and sucked dry. This sort of suction was so fierce that even the structure of space and time trembled. A small portion of it was annihilated, releasing an even more violent attack. This level of interference pointed directly to the microscopic level. Only the skill and experience of an extraordinary was able to achieve such a powerful effect under the premise that his mental senses were unable to completely comprehend and control the changes on this level. Unsurprisingly, the domain of the Blood Soul Temple was distorted and torn apart once again. It seemed that it would be difficult to mend it in a short period of time. The rock stratum at the top of the cavern exploded. The originally invisible shockwave was arrogantly exposed through the countless wide cracks that radiated in all directions and continued to extend. The source of all the cracks was the pitch-black hole in the rock stratum. The edge of the hole was smeared with the light formed by the interweaving lava and the greenish-gray cloud pillar. The light itself seemed to possess a corrosive power. It caused the newly formed hole to show signs of collapse in the blink of an eye. According to Gong Chi's calculations, the ominous shadow that was explosively proliferating should have been damaged at the same time as the hole. It should have touched the ceiling of its power level. Its soaring momentum was interrupted and it rapidly fell. It was then caught and suppressed by the greenish-gray cloud pillar. In reality, after the greenish-gray cloud pillar tore apart the domain of the Blood Soul Temple, it had already stirred up its remaining momentum. It was going to smash into the center of the rock stratum and not give the ominous shadow any chance to dodge. The other party did not dodge, but correspondingly, the explosive growth momentum that caused one's heart to palpitate did not weaken in the slightest. It did not seem to be affected at all. It did not give Gong Chi any chance to react at all. With that seemingly natural pace, it crushed through the ceiling that ability users from the inner world could not touch. It was like a flight of stairs that a normal person would casually step on. On the front where the greenish-gray cloud pillar and the Blood Soul Temple's domain contorted and collided, brilliant electric flames flickered once again. They struck and shuttled through the dark-colored cloud pillar, but it was not just a display of power. This was because the countless areas of electric light were formed from innumerable anions, cations, and water molecules. Under insufficient or even completely contradictory material conditions, in the complex environment where the extraordinary domain distorted and interfered, they accurately corresponded with the precise structures from other dimensions. They interfered with each other and quickly constructed a tyrannical and stable order of a different kind. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Love Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.